Video 9, flatten the curve. So, everybody will have heard about this, and it is useful to flatten the curve, but not in the way it is explained very often. It is explained like this. If the virus goes unchecked, this is the capacity of your healthcare system. Patients ramp up, you will be overwhelmed. These patients will not be treated, only a percentage of them. Here it will be better again. So if you flatten the curve, that you never overwhelm your healthcare system, you can have the same amount of patients, which is basically, they say, usually the amount that you reach herd immunity. But you flatten it, so you can everybody will have a nice warm bed, and in the end, you will have immunity, and nobody will have no ICU bed. Okay, I mean, people explain this all the time, and you think if you explain something, maybe you should, I don't know, try to understand it first. For Germany, for example, we have like 28,000 ICU beds. So you need some of them for obviously other patients who are there with other health problems. If you could dedicate 18,000 of these beds for corona patients, and if 6% of the corona patients need to have a ICU bed, that would mean that 3,000 of these, you have 18,000 beds, 6% need a bed. So 1% would be 3,000. So you could have 300,000 sick people with coronavirus at the same time. Because 1% would be 3,000, 6%, 18,000. So if you have 18,000 beds, you cannot have more than 300,000 sick people at one certain time if you don't want to overwhelm your system. Suppose, I have no idea about this number, but if an average one severely sick person needs an ICU bed for 1 week, you could in 1 month, could have 1.2 million sick people in 1 month, which means in a year something like 14 million. So in a population like Germany, where you need more than 50 million people to have immunity, and you have 14 million a year, it needs more than 3 years, obviously, right? So worldwide, the numbers differ, but maybe if you have less ICU beds, we have a lot of, it will be longer. With a country with a high standard of high healthcare system, it will take 3.5 years, to send your population through this disease without overwhelming your healthcare system. And only, which is completely unimaginably, if you have perfect tools of social engineering that you can, and actually monitoring, which is also not possible, that you can keep the number of sick people at a constant rate of 300,000. Because if you test, the results like at least 1 week later, if you have a test which is immediately, if you have a 3-day test 10 days later. So if you overshoot, you will realize it 10 days later. If your measures are too strict and not enough people are sick, you will realize it's 10 days later. So you have to serve this 300,000 all the time. I mean, it is impossible, first of all, and also it will take more than 3 years. In a country with less beds in an ICU capacity, it will need longer time. So at that time, we will have the vaccine probably anyway, and also many people would die, even, as I said, 1%, if you try to slowly, gradually. So if you flatten the curve, you can flatten it. It makes completely sense, because now we have to contain this again. We have to go back to the state where the virus is contained, like they showed actually in China and in South Korea, in Hong Kong and Singapore. It is possible, okay? So we have to flatten the curve before the shutdown. Other countries have to do this too, because if you shut down, as I showed in the videos before, the amount of infected people might stop at a certain time, but the amount of sick people will ramp up 1 week later. The amount of people who need a bed will be 2 weeks later will grow, and the amount of dead people will grow 3 weeks later. 3 weeks more. So if the curve is flattened, this growth will be less terrible. So it makes sense before the shutdown to flatten the curve as much as possible. But the option to flatten the curve and then, gradually, step by step, send your population through this healthcare system to be immune on the other side would take, in a country with a good healthcare system, more than 3 years. In another country, it might take 5 years. So it doesn't seem really doable for me.